Hello, it's Shelley F bringing you Positive Changes, a Self-Kick podcast. So today on the show, we're joined by the author, Andrew Seaton. So hello, Andrew.
Hello, Shelley.
Thank you so much for joining us today. So please do share with us your story of positive change.
Well, there have been many downs in my life, as well as the many ups. And one of the very big ones that I experienced, big down, big challenge, was about 5 years ago when, after several years, I finally managed to end the marriage that I was in. Had been in for 30 odd years. And it wasn't an unhappy marriage, but I had begun to feel for a number of years, somehow it's no longer right. And this was a huge challenge for me. Because it's not like, we fought all the time. So then I could sort of say, well, damn it, I've had that and walk out, It wasn't that kind of a situation. And even though I felt the need to leave my wife, I cared deeply about her still. And so this was an additional psychological burden, an emotional burden, and a kind of beliefs, in inverted commas, kind of burden about, obligation and loyalty and all those sorts of things. So I had to really grapple very in a fairly protracted way with that challenge of how to leave somebody I cared about, but just feeling that it no longer was right for me. And there were other challenges in amongst this big change that took place in my life 5 years ago. But as I say, I did eventually get to a point where one day somehow, my wife asked me what I was doing, and I was using some sort of divination technique. It wasn't tarot cards, but something like that to try and give me an answer. Should I leave or should I stay or whatever. And somehow, she asked me, "What are you doing?" And it was early in the morning, and I just somehow managed to blurt it out. And I said, "Well, I think I have to leave." And then it flowed from there. And a month later, I did. We sort of took our time, and I made my plans and set up a situation where my exiting was not going to have things fall in a heap. We were living on a hobby farm at that time, and sort of off grid. And so there were things that I needed to put in place to make it more manageable for my wife, my now ex, to kind of manage keeping things going. And I was the one that was going to depart the scene, But this was a huge emotional challenge for me. And as I say, I eventually got to a point where I managed to say I needed to leave, and I did leave. That still wasn't making it easy. I mean, I still had all the emotion of a separation of after quite a long marriage, 30 odd years. As I say, somebody I cared about, not really having a plan B for myself, and so there was all this stuff, but without making the broader aspects of what that challenge involved for me, that change, just the aspect of leaving my wife was very, very difficult. And it took me several years after having left that I managed to come to terms emotionally with that whole experience. I had all sorts of turbulent emotions, not only leading up, but even more so following making the decision to leave and actually departing. And So this helped me to process things that I had come to understand in the past, but had never really grappled with effectively or so intensively. It helped me to discover the tremendous effectiveness of, first of all, recognizing that the emotional reaction that we have to the things that we experience are not due to what we've experienced. I found myself that, to put it back in the first person, it wasn't the fact of having left my wife that caused me emotional turmoil. It was because there were times when I was, it had still happened, right? A month later, or 6 months later, or 12 months later, it had still happened, but I felt fine.
Yeah.
I had good days and good moments and, lots of that, but a lot of turmoil along with it. So what I came to understand was that it wasn't having left my wife that caused me problems, that caused me guilt, that caused me loneliness, that caused me to feel I'd been disloyal, to feel regret that my wife was hurting my wife. Well, for a while it was my wife still, and then eventually it was my ex. So, but what I realized was that when I felt bad, it was because a thought had popped up in my mind that said, it's bad what happened, or I'm bad because of what I did, or if the situation is bad because of this reason. And I started to see very clearly in relation to this and other things that happened in my life, this tremendously liberating insight that it's not what I experience that ever troubles me. What troubles me is when I have a thought that pops up in my mind and I believe the thought
Yeah.
that says what I'm experiencing is bad, or what has just happened is bad, or what that person said to me is bad, or what I said to that person is bad. This is what triggers all the negative emotions. So here's something that I can pass on to your listeners, Shelley, in regards to this. There's a couple of things actually. And I don't know if we're getting out of sync with the kind of questions that you wanted to ask me or not. But you know, when anybody feels then troubled by an emotion, the first thing to do that it can be very helpful in dissolving the intensity of the emotion in the short term can be, first of all, to notice, first of all, acknowledge that you're feeling a particular emotion. So if I was feeling, for example, at certain times lonely, first thing would be to notice and acknowledge, yes, wow, really at the moment I'm feeling very lonely. But then here's the thing that really helps to dissolve the power and the intensity of the emotion. When I would shift from, okay, I'm feeling lonely or I am lonely, when I said to myself, I am the awareness that's noticing a feeling of loneliness, it put a space between who I truly am, the observing, formless awareness that notices my experience throughout my life. That's always been me, this noticer of the thoughts that pop up, of the emotions that arise, of the things that I perceive, and so forth. Now, for most of my life, I was very identified with the thoughts that came up, with the emotions that came up. I kind of felt like they were me, and I was those things as they happened. But what I began doing, learning to do, and it became easier and easier and more effective as things went on, I noticed that I was the quiet, observing awareness, noticing an emotion arising, for example. So when I began to feel lonely, I would say, okay, yeah, I'm lonely. I feel lonely. And then I would say to myself, I'm the awareness, or sometimes I would say, I'm the formless awareness that's noticing a feeling of loneliness. And this immediately put a space between who I truly am and the emotion of loneliness, as an example. And what happened? Wow, amazing. The feeling of loneliness would lose its intensity. And then I would take another step and uh, ask myself the question, okay, so there's this feeling of loneliness, for example, that's arisen, or a feeling of, guilt because, of course, this hurt to my wife or my ex-wife as examples. And then I would say to myself, okay, I'm feeling this emotion, but what's the thought that I'm having and believing that's triggering that emotion?
Yeah.
So let's take the example of I was feeling lonely. So I'd first of all say I'm the awareness noticing this feeling of loneliness. That would all to immediately begin to reduce the intensity of the feeling. And then I'd ask myself, now what's the thought that's coming up that I'm believing that's triggering this feeling of loneliness? And it was usually something as simple as, it's bad to be alone.
Yeah.
And when I would say, well, okay, yeah, I'm having this thought. I can see that there is this thought. It's bad to be alone, or it's wrong to be alone, or, I don't want to be alone, but I am alone. And then I would ask myself, now, do I know for certain that this thought that's popped up, that I'm thinking, this thought that it's bad to be alone, do I know for certain that it's true? Well, then I would have to acknowledge, well, there's no way I can know all the flow-on effects of me being here alone. So in that sense, I can't know for sure that that thought that it's bad that I'm alone is true. Then I'd ask myself, is it possible that it could have some good outcomes? And then immediately I would have to admit, well, yes, it is possible. There are all sorts of possible things that could come up. I mean, one example is, of course, it's prompting me to deal with this question about, how do I manage my emotions? And, just it helped me to discover what really causes my emotions, which is believing a thought rather than what I'm experiencing. That was one thing I could, I was able to early on say, well, this is a good thing, which is actually flowing out of that. And then there's another thought that, well, because I'm here by myself, I've actually got time, for example, now, I've just written a book. Now, this being alone for a few years, living alone, uh, I may never have written this book that I've just written if I hadn't found myself in this very different space, having the time, having the opportunity, having the no distractions. So then I'd have to say, well, yes, that's another thing I can see that, I quite like the fact that I've been able to write this book, and that's flowed out of the fact that I was by myself a lot of the time. So I'd, more and more then I would question in different ways. I'd be able to see. I would also ask myself, well, who's noticing the thought that it's bad to be by myself? Oh, okay. Well, I'm the formless awareness that's noticing that thought that's popped up. So I'm not the thought because I'm the one that's noticing the thought. I
Yeah.
didn't even choose the thought. It's just sitting there. And so silly me if I buy into it, and then it causes me, I fall into an emotional heap. So these simple processes I began to use more and more and more, especially in 2017. And every little thing that happened through most days, I would take note of it and quickly, as it were, nip it in the bud. Look at what's thought is triggering any kind of response that I might have, even just the minor ones, a little disappointment here, a little frustration there, sometimes a bigger one, but quite often just little ones. Somebody did something very annoying in the traffic, and I bang my horn, and then I'd say, now, do I know for sure actually that it's bad that that person did that? Well, no, I can't know for sure that all the flow-on effects are going to be bad. Is it possible it could have any good consequences? Well, yes, it could have. It could cause me to respond differently in particular kinds of traffic situations than I've done in the past to avoid that possibility. For example, if somebody cut in front of me and it nearly hit me, I would then say, oh well, I've realised that it's actually safer to keep a bit of a larger space between me and the car in front in case somebody else does cut in front. I mean, just to give it a tiny little example.
Yeah.
So all the time I was watching the thoughts that were popping up, any emotions that might have been associated, and questioning them. And when I realised increasingly that any thought that popped up that things were bad, or my life or my day in some way was insufficient, or not what it should be, or not what I wanted it to be, I quickly realized there's no way that I can know that those troubling thoughts are true. So the emotions ceased to come up as much. When they did come up, I could dissolve them very quickly. And a few years later, I find my life is just completely different. I have so much peace in my life almost all the time. And when something does arise that annoys me or frustrates me or whatever, I can look at it and very quickly dissolve it and come back into feeling peaceful.
Yeah, and I think there's so much value in what you're saying, Andrew, because we do like label our emotions. We get very attached to them. We dive full on into them. You know, like I am
Yes,
bored, I am lonely, I made a bad choice, and it's like self-criticism, isn't it? And it's self-punishment, and
yes,
it's okay to, which I don't know if it is actually. I say it's okay to label it, but I think when you're aware of it, that's far more powerful and far more useful as well.
yes. Well, you can label what you've become aware of, but yes, you've pointed out the real trick is to not fall into identifying with it.
Yeah,
It's different to say, yes, I'm going to label this feeling that's arisen as anger. I'm noticing that it's a feeling of anger has arisen. That's fine to label it in that way.
yeah,
It's quite different, though, from saying, "Oh, I feel so furious." You know,
yeah.
no, I'm not furious. I'm the one's noticing furious, and it's so incredibly different.
It is totally different. And I love that because, you know, I mean, we all have to have emotions. I don't think there are good emotions and bad emotions. I think there's just emotions and, you know, there's no mistakes, it's just experience. But I love the way it's very peaceful, very mindful, how you're bringing awareness to it. And then, like, you know, a bit like an onion, you're peeling back the layers,
Yes,
like, you know, this is what it
yes,
looks like. But if you start to peel back,
yes,
where's this coming from? Like in grief, we often see that you get really angry family members, but actually they're quite fearful when you sort of say, what's
yes,
beyond this fear? And you go back and back and back. So I love
yes.
it. I love the fact, it sounds slightly oxymoron, I love the fact you left your wife, but but it's not that. I just see so many people clinging on to relations beyond the point where they're
Yes,
broken, but you seem to have
yes, yes,
like an
indeed.
intuitive niggle or a knowing that there was something else coming. And I just love the courage that must have taken. You know, like, I love the fact you walked in there, you're having a little dabble with the cards. But, you know, did you have an intuitive niggle that it was at the
It
end, even though,
was,
yeah,
yes, and thank you for your comment that you like the fact that I found the courage. I appreciate you saying that, and I've sometimes, as it were, patted myself on the back too that I did find the courage, and you know it's actually been huge. This thing that you're pointing out is actually huge because um, there's a lovely. It's expressed very nicely by Eileen Caddy. Just pops in my mind. She's the lady who started the Findhorn Foundation, and she says, cease trying to work out everything in your mind. It'll get you nowhere. Live your life by intuition and by inspiration and let your life be revelation. And this is how I've learned to begin to live. And it is more real, far more uh, peace filled and contentment filled, but also it puts me in touch with life. The organizing principle that's underlying all of life can now work with me, through me, as me, because I'm open to this little intuitions that pop up more and more. And it was kind of, in a sense, I mean, big inverted commas, but it was kind of like a big test, you know. And as you said, a lot of people will be in a situation and they'll feel a niggle, but they'll ignore it, or they'll, you know,
yeah,
they'll suppress it. They'll put it aside. It's too hard, basket. You know, no, I don't want to go there, you know, kind of thing. And I kind of myself, I grappled with it for several years. 4 or 5 years, just this feeling would come up, and this is not right. I need to. Oh no, I can't do it. You know, and eventually, I just managed to somehow. I did manage to respond to this intuition that I needed to leave. And I'm so thankful that I did manage to do that, because it's then opened the floodgates of my ability to be responsive to intuitions across the board all the time. So my life now does begin to be lived more by intuition. And this makes a life so much more satisfying and so
yeah.
much more filled with contentment, because I feel, even though, you know, challenges and things come along, but I feel like I'm in sync with life.
Yeah.
And for many years in my life, I was looking, how does this all fit? How does life work? And I just didn't feel in sync with life. And the funny thing is, not so funny most of the time actually, but the funny thing is that the very thing that we think that we rely on as a guide in our life is the thing that actually gets in our way most of the time. And you know what that is? Our mind.
Yeah.
We are so identified with the thoughts that pop up, and which almost all of which are conditioned from our earliest childhood. They're just programming, and we live our lives, most of us, most of the time, on automatic, playing out these conditioned patterns of thinking, of emotion, of behavior, of experience. And our life takes a particular shape because of patterns of functioning. And the ironic thing is that when we begin to question the thoughts, that we usually just respond to it and do the thing that the thought says, well, I'm this kind of person, or this is what I think, I'll go and do it. Because we don't really question them, our life becomes a reflection of conditioned patterns, which are not reality. And because they're not reality, life can't be fulfilling, because the life that we're experiencing is a reflection of something which is not based in reality.
Yeah. And I truly believe that. I mean, I was speaking to someone just this week, and I said, like, when we're born into a name that we didn't choose. So straight away, choices are being made for us. Like, I'm known as Shelley, but my actual name's Michelle. I don't like it, So as soon as we're born, we're taking on things that aren't ours to take on. And it is like when you say, like, oh, that's naughty, you shouldn't have done that, or you shouldn't have said that to them, that's wrong. And that's how we start to bring up. We think we're, with the best intention in our heart as parents, teachers, carers, aunties, uncles. We're saying these things, think we're raising a polite child. But there's a lot of blame in it, isn't it? The words we use, sort of like, you shouldn't say that, you made them feel like that, you made me feel like that. And there is so much conditioning. And then we get older, we make it through all of these rules and regulations, and we get that inner niggle, that search, thinking, I don't know if this is me. Again, it's a bit like an onion. You're peeling back, like, I look like this on the outside, but inside, I didn't make them feel like that. They chose that. Is this my life purpose? And like your marriage, you know what I mean? It must have been so hard to sit there thinking, I have a good life, but then sometimes you need that leap of faith to have a great life.
Yes, and it's, as you say, the mind can so easily come in and give reasons why I should be grateful for what I've got, so to speak.
Yeah.
Or the mind can come in. It was good what you mentioned, that word blame, because one of of course, the conceptual mind is a world of opposites.
Yeah.
Every concept has its opposite, and one of the core opposites that we get conditioned into operating out of is, of course, good and bad.
Yeah.
Right and wrong, good and bad. I'm good or I'm bad. What I said was good or it was bad. What I achieved was either good or bad. It was a failure or it was a success. So many of the thoughts that pop up in our mind about ourselves and about the people around us and the world around us are judgments.
Yeah.
And when you look at them, this is the amazing thing. You can never know that any judgment you make about anything can be true for certain. And when you start unhooking from this automatic judging conditioned mind, this is partly what allows so much peace to bubble up in our lives. Because who we are in reality is this peace-filled observing awareness. It's not like we need to become anything or achieve anything or get anything in order to become happy and contented in our lives. This is the strange myth that's out there in the world that we grow up in. If you achieve this, or if you become that, or if you get that, if you get this brownie point, this award, or this, all sorts of things. If you earn a label of being good, or you become a profession that's regarded as being good, you become a doctor, or you become a this or whatever, this will bring you peace and satisfaction. Myth, 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 myth. Because everything that's labeled good has its opposite of what's bad. And if we get some of the things that we label to be good, what about if I lose them? What about if something comes along, a situation arises, or a person comes into my life that presents some sort of threat to those things that are in my life that I think are good? So this looking for what's good is a very twin-edged sword, because good doesn't exist without bad. But as William Shakespeare pointed out in Hamlet, nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so.
Yeah.
So it's only the conditioned mind that's tying our emotions and our minds and our lives in knots because of all of this attachment to the things we think are good and the things that we think are bad.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of, like, as you were saying it, I was thinking of yin and yang, where you've got the dark and the light, and like we've got the night and day, but together it makes up the whole 24 hours. And I always say to my kids, there's no such thing as perfection. Do you know what I mean? If you do something which is deemed as naughty, it's not. Do you know what I mean? We've got good and bad, but I don't like it when people sort of hide their shadow side. Do you know what I mean? We've all got a little naughty side to us. Do you know what I mean? Like, I can be awfully polite, but I could also scream at someone if I really wanted to. And that's what makes
Yes.
me whole. Do you know what I mean? I'm not angelic. I have a dark side, and that is my
Yes.
wholeness, you know.
But yes, but the funny thing is, there's not just the good and the bad, or the yin and the yang, or the light and the dark. The interesting thing that I discovered about all this is that I'm not the bad things that I've said or believed about myself, but I'm equally not the good things that I've said or believed about myself. I'm neither of those things. And I'd like to give your listeners just a very simple taste of how they can begin to notice this about themselves. A very simple way is to think back to when they were a little kid, when they were 6 or 8 or 10. Did they feel like they were them? Most people get a nod and say, well, yeah, of course I did. I remember when I was about 10 and I felt like I was me. And what about in your mid-teens? Did you feel like you were you? Of course I did. When you were 20, 30, 40? Yeah, I felt like I was me. But has your body changed over those many years? Well, yeah, in big ways. And what about some of the things that you believe about yourself or people or the world? Have some of those beliefs changed? Well, yeah, lots of them have. Some of them are actually, as one person said to me recently, most of mine have done a 180, you know. And I believe now the reverse of what I believed, you know, perhaps 10 years ago or whatever. And what about the roles that you've had? Have they changed? Yeah, once I was a primary school student, then I was a high school student, then I was a shop assistant, and then I became a nurse. I think you were a nurse, were you?
I was, yeah, till last year,
At
yeah.
one time? Right. Now, so the interesting thing when we look at the various roles that we've had at different stages of our life, because they've changed, and yet I've always felt like I was me. The feeling of that I am me and I've always been me, that's a constant. So I'm not the body that I had when I was 10. I'm not the beliefs I had when I was 10 or 20 or 30. I'm not the roles I had. I'm not the nurse that I was. I'm not the school teacher in my case that I was. I'm not any one of another 10 different jobs I've had at different times in my life. None of those were who I am. And so, well, who are you? Well, you're that sense of being that's always been with you, always been you, most of the time kind of in the background of your life experience, but you've always felt like you were you. That constant is who you truly are. And that constant is actually when we allow it to be there, by questioning and dissolving thoughts and emotions that we kind of identify with. Our identifying with those things is what masks the peace-filled, contentment-filled, joy-filled, playfulness-filled awareness, which is our true nature. So when we question, as we've been talking about, you know, our emotions and our thoughts, and realize that we can't know for sure that they're true, they're not real, they just dissolve into dust. And what's left is who we truly are. Presence, just here, fully aware, calm, peace-filled, fun-filled, and that's what life becomes for people then as they do these processes that I talk about in my book, and that I've discovered for myself over many years, but in the last few years only, partly because of these very intensive challenges that I I confronted, I've been able to pull the essentials together in a way that makes it very simple to begin to live my life and to show other people how they can begin to live their life in a way that's very satisfying and uh, characterized by a lot of contentment and peace, because we're living from the essence of who we are in reality, not from the conditioned patterns of thinking and emotion that we've tended mistakenly to identify with for so many years.
Yeah. When I started this podcast, it actually started off as a solo show. It's just me and my book, Positive Changes, a self-kick book. And the second episode of the podcast was Who Am I? And you make it sound quite simple, but I actually think it's quite complex of knowing who you are. Because on the back of my book, my blurb was kind of sort of like wife, mother, daughter, nurse, clinical hypnotherapy, general labeled being. And again, it comes back to the label, like you're labeling your emotions, but you're actually being labeled like, so I'm like Harrison's mum, Wesley's wife, Lynette's daughter, you know, I'm all those things. But when I think, who am I didn't really know at times, you know, and I went back to uni to do another course. And I think, oh, is this who I am? So you make it sound lovely and simple, but for me, it felt far more complex. And it's kind of taking those 10 minutes a day to sit there and see what comes up. And maybe that's why what you had when you had that niggle come up, you had a good marriage, but you had that niggle that I don't know if this is who I am. So I think for some people it might be really simple, quick light bulb moments, but for others it is kind of finding peaceful moments and trusting what comes up, because the head just comes in all the time going, but you're married, but you're a mum. Yeah.
Yes. Well, that's right. The way we generally live, human beings generally live, is that these things do come up automatically. Yeah. Can't think of the phrase, but they're running in every waking moment. The mind is just running. And initially it seems like a tremendously difficult thing to find the stillness, that is at the back of all of that. In actual fact, it's not difficult at all. And that's why I specifically wanted to get in the name of my book, Made Simple. I've called the book Spiritual Awakening Made Simple, because in actual fact, it is very, very simple to come back. It takes only seconds when you read through the book, and the book itself is only 100 pages, and it's not a book about, concepts. It's not about, it might be tricky to really understand and get the gist of this. No, it's a book of self-discovery, a lot of little things people can do for themselves, realizations light bulbs that'll go off as they read through, a lot of anecdotes from my personal life, illustrations to show people, and in a way that they can discover for themselves how this works, that it only takes seconds to come back to the stillness of who we are. Now, the trick is here not to look for the correct definition of who we are, because the funny thing is that we can never know, the conceptual mind can never know who I am, because who I am is beyond the conceptual mind. And nothing I can perceive, I look down at my body, look at my hand, that's not who I am in my essence. So the funny thing is that who we truly are is not something we can know conceptually or perceptually. No thought that comes into my mind, no concept, no definition is who I am, because I'm the awareness that notices any thoughts that pop up. I'm the awareness that notices my body and its functioning. And so who we truly are is beyond the mind, but it's nevertheless awareness. It's formless awareness. It has a lovely, very, very subtle quality, indefinable quality of peacefulness, contentedness, often playfulness, lovingness. This is the essence of who we are, without the definitions of those things. And then, the mind goes into its games, and then, but then you did this nasty thing, so you can't be loving, blah. This is all mind games. And then you can quickly question those, come out of identifying with the mind and back into the peace of who you are. Now, you mentioned this thing about, the thoughts that come up and the thoughts about who I am. And in the book, I explain 3 ways that we generally try to deal with troubling thoughts. I won't go into them now because it might take me 5 or 10 minutes even to summarize them. But the 3 ways that we commonly use don't work. We try to distract ourselves, we try to suppress the thoughts, we try to focus only on the good thoughts. These methods don't work. But it's very simple when you're shown how, and I show in the book, to use method 4, which is to question the thought. Do I know for certain that that thought is true? And no conceptual idea, and philosophers, East and West, ancient and modern, so many of them have drawn this conclusion. No conceptual idea can ever be proven to be true for certain. And when you realize that the thoughts that come up, you can't know they're true, then you're left with, when they collapse onto the floor, you're left with the peaceful awakeness that you are.
Fabulous. So your book is called Spiritual Awakening Made Simple, but then it's not very simple because it's got a very long tagline. So is it called Spiritual? It's a slightly oxymoron. So it's called Spiritual Awakening Made Simple, How to See Through the Mist of the Mind to the Peace of the Here and Now.
Yeah, it's simple. It's not necessarily all the time easy, and it's not all the time short. but like the subtitle, it's not short. And then I almost deliberately kind of made it like a bit of a longer one. How to see through the mist of the mind that we live in. Generally, we live in call it a fog, call it a mist, call it clouds, head in the clouds. We tend as human beings to live our lives out in this mist of the mind, but how to see through the mist of the mind to the peace of the here and now, the presence that is our real nature. And I've part of the reason I've said in the title, made simple, spiritual awakening made simple, and spiritual is just referring to this formless nature of who we are. That's why I say spiritual. It's just not material. It's not form definable. So it's infinite, non-finite, spiritual, made simple, because there's so much that's said and written about human identity and human happiness and spirituality, if you like to, that comes from the mind. And it seems to be out in the world, you go into a library, you go into a bookshop, you go online, that there are so many opinions about all these things. It seems infinitely complex. That's a myth. It's a myth that's inevitable when we try to figure it all out in our mind. And our mind loves nothing better than to chew on a problem that's complicated, the chewing on it makes it more complicated.
Yeah.
And you can look at it this way, you can look at it that way, you can look at it that way. Yeah, what about this way? Yes, you can look at it that way. That's mind games. But actually, it's simple.
Bless you. Thank you so much for joining us today. There's so much food for thought. I just love it from the relationship side, the divination, the simplicity of it. Thank you. So if you want to reach out, I've got you down at your website, Awakening Made Simple, and then you're Andrew Seaton 101 on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Pinterest.
That's correct, yes.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your journey with us.
Thanks, Shelley. It was fun talking with you.
Thank you. If you enjoyed today's episode, please ensure you subscribe and do leave a positive review. If you would like to create your own positive changes, head on over to shelleyfknight.com and you can buy yourself a copy of Positive Changes, a self-cookbook. If you want some positivity until the next show, come join us over on Facebook. That's Shelley F. Knight, Life Goes On. So I've been Shelley F. Knight, and as always, you've been amazing.